In this screencast, I will explain the notes in preparation for reading the Declaration of Independence. Please take notes on your handout. As I go through, first I will explain the definition and then explain how it applies specifically to the Declaration of Independence. So first, let's go ahead and take a look at genre. Genre is a specific type of writing characterized by similarities in form, style, or subject matter. So some questions you want to ask yourself to determine the genre is, what does the text look like? What is the text structure? And why is the text written this way considering the purpose? So how genre applies to the Declaration of Independence. It can be categorized as an open letter because there are signatures at the bottom of it. It also can be described as a historical document because it is the foundation for America's history. It's also a political document because it's the foundation for America's government. And finally, and most importantly, it is a persuasive document because it is trying to convince someone to believe or do something. So let's go ahead and take a look at physically what it looks like. Here are some replications of it. As you can see at the top here, we have the writing, which they did handwrite using these old style feather pens. But notice here at the bottom, those are the signatures. All of the signatures from the men who helped to create this document. Okay, so that does categorize it as partly a letter. Okay, next let's talk about audience. Audience is the specific person or people you are writing for. Some questions to ask yourself to determine the audience. Who is the text written to? Is there a specific class, race, gender, sexuality, citizenship, religion, age, marital status, education, or occupation? And then it's also important to know if the audience is neutral, friendly, or hostile, because that helps to know how you're going to approach them. If you, for example, if you have a hostile audience, then you want to make sure that you approach them in a way since they already have a negative attitude toward you. Okay, so how does audience apply to the Declaration of Independence? Although the Declaration of Independence was a formal declaration of war, as stated in the title, the Declaration of Independence, directed to King George III and the British government, it was also an inspirational document used to unite the American colonists in the cause of the revolution. But most importantly, it was used as a plea to foreign nations, particularly England's European enemies, for support of American independence. So let's take a look at a visual that shows that broken up. So there are three main target audiences. First, they are directly talking to King George and the British government, telling them why they're doing this. Also, to the American colonists. You can imagine that it was difficult to get people to fight, most likely to their death, for their independence. So you can think of this as a motivational document also. And then finally, in order for them to be able to win this war, they were going to need support from foreign nations or from the world, specifically England's enemies. Okay, so that's audience. Next, let's talk about purpose. Purpose is the reason an author decides to write about a specific topic. So, for example, you can ask yourself, is the author writing to inform, persuade, entertain, or explain his ideas? What change or impact is wanted on the audience? And what should the audience do, think, or believe afterward? So how does this apply to the Declaration of Independence? Well, first, it explains why the colonies should break away from Britain. Here we can see a visual of that happening. To convince the world that what they're doing is justified. To outline the principles that were the foundation for declaring independence. and to announce their political separation from Britain. So for this next part, please complete your paragraph by adding the red words. Here we have persuasion is writing that presents an argument or message meant to get readers to think or act in a certain way. Effective persuasion uses the following techniques to build arguments. So let's talk about those techniques. You're already familiar with 3 of these, and then I will introduce a new one. First, we have appeal to emotion, which is pathos, used to influence readers' feelings and emotions. How this applies to the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson used pathos to convince the audience to hate the King of Britain because of all the tyrannical things he did to the colonists. So here's an example from one section of the text. The text, we can divide it into 5 sections. One of the sections is called The Indictment of King George III. And here's a quote, he destroyed the lives of our people. And actually, this entire section, the indictment, is pathos. And here we have a visual of the colonists. We hate King George. Next, we have appeal to logic or logos. Definition, used to show that an argument is correct or logical. How this applies to the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson uses logos to explain that it is logical that if a government is not doing its job, then the people have a right to change or get rid of that government. Here's a quote from the preamble. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. And another quote from the conclusion, that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war. And here we have a visual of the American colonists saying to King George III and the British government, you are not doing your job, we want a new government. Next, we have appeal to ethics or ethos. Definition, used to show that an argument is just or fair because the speaker or writer has a good character or credibility. How this applies to the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson uses ethos to explain that it is only just and fair for them to be happy. Here's a quote from the preamble. We hold these truths to be self-evident. And here's a quote from the conclusion. These united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. And here's a little graphic that explains that. The American colonists talking to King George III. We have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And this is one that is new to you. Appeal to authority. The definition is used to show that a higher power supports the ideas. There are many references in the Declaration of Independence to a higher power, meaning God. Okay. So how this applies to the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson uses authority to appeal to the world. Here's a quote from the preamble, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Okay, so he's saying there they've been given rights by their creator, meaning God. Another quote from the conclusion, appealing to the supreme judge of the world in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies. And another quote from the conclusion, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. Divine, again, relating to God. And here's a visual of the American colonists saying to King George III, God gave us certain unalienable rights that you can't take away. So for this part, please complete your paragraph by adding the red words. Persuasive writers may also use words with strong connotations to produce an intense emotional response. The denotation of a word is the dictionary definition, whereas the connotation of a word is the feeling that is associated with the word. A charged or loaded word is a word that evokes a strong positive or negative reaction by the reader or listener. Charged or loaded words are meant to appeal to a person's emotions. The writers of the Declaration of Independence purposely used charged or loaded words to persuade the world to support them in their separation from Britain. So let's just let me explain in a little bit more detail the difference between denotation and connotation. Okay, so denotation is just the definition you would find in the dictionary. Connotation would be the feelings associated with the word. Not every word has a connotation. Okay, so let's take a look at these 4 words. We have thin, skinny, slender, or scrawny. They all mean pretty much the same thing, but which word connotates a slight insult about being underweight? Right? You probably wouldn't be mad if when someone called you thin, skinny, or slender, but when you call someone scrawny, that indicates somebody who is kind of small or weak. So that word has a negative connotation to it. So let's look at some examples of charged words from the Declaration of Independence. Okay, these all come from the indictment of King George, also known as the Crimes of the King, the middle section of the document, in which they list all the crimes that the king has committed against them. And they use these very strong, powerful, charged and loaded words because they really bring about an emotional reaction by somebody. So first we have plundered, which is a verb. Now, the denotation means to steal goods from a place, person using force, okay? But the connotation is very negative, and it makes you think of a thief. So they want the people to think of the king as a thief and the people that he sent over. So that's why they use that word plundered. Next, we have ravage, which is also a verb. It means to do ruinous damage. It makes you think of death and destruction, which is what they want people to associate with the king, death and destruction. So that's why they use that verb. Barbarous is an adjective. It means savagely cruel or exceedingly brutal. Definitely has a negative connotation and makes you think of someone evil. They want people to think of the king as evil. And finally, we have executioners. It's a noun. It's an official who carries out a death sentence. That is definitely a negative feeling. It makes you think of a murderer, someone who kills others. Okay, so final question here. How are all the words above charged or loaded words, and why do you think that Jefferson used these words? How are they effective? These are all charged and loaded words because they bring out a strong emotional response in the audience. Jefferson used these words because they wanted the world to see the king as a tyrant and hate him as much as they did. They were very effective because they were able to gain support from the world based on their persuasive document. So think about it. If the colonists had not written this document that was so persuasive, would we now, in the United States of America, be an independent nation? Or would we still be under Britain's rule? Okay, we know that they were effective because they did gain support and they did gain independence. But without the support that they gained from this document, they might not have won the revolution. Okay, so these notes are going to be very helpful for you in understanding the text. Please make sure that you keep them close to you and refer back to them as you are reading, and then definitely when you are getting ready to do your writing response. And that is all the pre-notes for the Declaration of Independence.